So welcome everyone, so that our Flex students can hear it too. This course in Indian philosophy basically deals with two questions. That might seem very little for 12 weeks, that all we are going to do is answer two questions. But those questions are looked at from different perspectives. Indian philosophy is not, philosophy of one group of people. There are many different philosophies in India, in ancient India, and what we are going to look at is the philosophy in ancient India, but from different perspectives. So these two questions will be looked at from the perspective of the Hindu philosophers, which is the predominant philosophy in India, from the perspective of Buddhist philosophers, which is also, in fact, now more popular in the rest of the world than it is in India. And I'll get to what the reasons are for that. There are also some other schools of Indian philosophy that we will be looking at. There's the Jaina school and also the Charvaks. Now, the Charvaks are the materialist tradition in India, which is not often talked about at all. And there is very little literature available from the Charvak school, but that's also something we will consider in the course. So we'll be looking at these two questions from the perspective of Hindu philosophers. And again, Hindu philosophers, not all Hindu philosophers have the same view. There are many different schools of Hindu philosophy as well within the Hindu tradition. So I'll be telling you about some of the schools. I'll give you a flavor of, what they do, what they specialize in, why they became different schools, why not, just one Hindu philosophy. So the two questions that we are concerned with, one is a question in ethics. That's the question is, how should one live? Basic philosophical question, how should one live to achieve one's best in life? What's the best way to live? And most cultures are concerned with that question. The other question is, what is the nature of a person? What kinds of beings are we? What kinds of beings are we? In order to answer the first question, what's the best way for us to live? We need to understand what kinds of beings are we so that we can achieve our best within this life. I have to have the qualification within this life because very soon we are going to start talking about many different lives. There's not just one life, there's many different lives according to the Hindus, and we'll discuss what the reasons are for going that way. So one of the questions I would like to address first, I have it on the handout, is why study Indian philosophy? But before we do that, did I give you a handout? But before we do that, it might be interesting to just get a view of what philosophy is and how is it different from other disciplines. Just because there are lots of people here who haven't done philosophy before. From those of you who've done philosophy, what do you think is different about philosophy? And this is going to be all the time an interactive class. I'm not going to be lecturing at you. Stop me whenever you think, just raise a hand or a finger. Whenever you think you have a question. So from those of you who've done some philosophy, how do you think philosophy is different from other disciplines? Is it the questions that are different? Is it the way we approach the questions? What's different in philosophy? You've studied other disciplines at school or at university. How is philosophy different from other disciplines? Yeah? Yeah, there's a lot of room for discussion, and there's lots you feel you can add to it. Yeah. Good point of view. Anyone else? What's the difference between studying philosophy and history of ideas? Why are we just not interested in what Descartes said, or what Buddha said, or something like that? Here's what I think is distinctive about philosophy. Everyone has some idea. Every culture, every person Every human being has some idea about, or has some views about the way the world is and our place in it. How is the world constituted, whether, it's today's culture, a very scientific, materially oriented culture. And we think, basically, most of it is material. Consciousness, we are a bit unsure still about, but the rest of it is mostly material. Everyone has a view about, the world in which we live and our place in the world, and, how do we go about making the most of it. That's not philosophy. Philosophy happens when we start questioning it. When there is discussion about, when there is criticism, when there is a critical discussion about whether what we take for granted, whatever our worldview is, whatever our view is about what persons are, or what we are, or whatever group we belong to, we start questioning whether that's the right view. That's when philosophy begins. So, when does philosophy begin in India? The predominant culture, as I said before, was the Hindu culture. That comes from the Vedas. I'll say a bit more about it shortly. But the most important point is philosophy really, sort of starts happening, if you like, in India when the Buddha comes on the scene. Not because he's a special being at that time, but because he starts questioning the doctrines that the Hindus have believed forever. Once the Buddhists come on the scene, philosophy happens, so to say, in India. Just having a worldview doesn't amount to philosophy. It is critical discussion about the worldview, which doesn't mean necessarily you throw away the view. Philosophy shouldn't just mean, oh, I get rid of every possible opinion. That's not it. But, even if you're going to accept that worldview, you need to have a reasoned argument for that course. That's what philosophy is. For those of you who are new to philosophy, philosophy is, trying to build up a reasoned argument for what you believe. There is lots of scope in philosophy to add your own view. Independent thinking, is what we want to teach you, but it is at the same time structured thinking. You need to learn how to defend the view you'd like to defend in a structured manner. And that's what happens in Indian philosophy. When the Buddhists come on the scene, there is questions raised about the Hindu worldview. There is questions raised about the Hindu view of the person or the self. The Hindus believe that the self is eternal. The Buddhists say, no, it isn't. And these are very difficult questions to handle. Debate continues for centuries on this question. From about the 500 BC, when the Buddha was born, up to the 10th century AD. There is fierce debate between the Hindus and the Buddhists, and they still didn't resolve it. So we can still add something to it. That's what we are going to do in this class, look very closely at that debate, both on the ethical issues as well as on the metaphysical issues, and see, what was at question. Most of this course is going to focus on the Hindu-Buddhist debate, but I will have something to say about the Charvaks, because I think the materialists in the Indian tradition do not get enough attention in any course in Indian philosophy, or even in, textbooks in Indian philosophy. Any questions at this point? So I think I've given you enough reason why you should study philosophy. Philosophy trains you, in one sense, to learn how to build up reasoned arguments, and that's a skill that will be good for you right across the board. Now, those of you who've done philosophy, why should one study Indian philosophy? What's distinctive about studying a philosophy from a different culture? Why is it important to study philosophy from different cultures? I mean, one of the things that's big in today's world is diversity, right? We need to understand other cultures. We think lots of problem is happening because we fail to understand other cultures. Lots of problems in this world are because of lack of understanding. I think I'm going to go further. stick my neck out and say, yes, you know, we need to understand, but we also need to be critical at the same time. You know, we shouldn't just stop at trying to understand other cultures. That is important, but at the same time, we need to be able to have, you know, to have a critical eye to look at those cultures and call them out when need be, including the Indians. You know, that's what we are going to do in this class. When we think that the arguments are not good enough, you know, we'll call them out. And so that's what I think we should do. That there is reason to study Indian philosophy. There's, I don't know if you, it might be interesting for you to have a look at, you know, there are articles these days, New York Times, in the Atlantic, in Washington Post. There's a lot of noise in America about Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy, Asian traditions, Islamic philosophy not being taught in those departments. And so people are making noise that it is important for us to hire people and to diversify our curriculum, you know, and do it urgently, because otherwise, you know, there's a huge injustice being done. I disagree with that view. The reason I'm telling you is I think it's still valuable to study Indian philosophy, but not because I want to ride the diversity bandwagon, as I call it. You know, not because I think everyone should, it's essential to study Indian philosophy. Let me explain why. Let me give you some reasons why I think there's nothing special about Indian philosophy. First reason is that the questions we ask in Indian philosophy are the same questions you'd ask in any other philosophy course. Those of you who've done the introductory philosophy course, Time, Self, and Mind, have looked at this question about what we are essentially. You know, what's the nature of persons? And those of you who've done the Descartes course or will do other courses, you'll come across this question in philosophy courses all the time. Those of you who've done ethics will look at, you know, ethics of, look at the question of how should one live. So there's nothing distinctive about the questions that the Indians are addressing. There's nothing distinctive about, you know, not just the questions, even the answers that they give. You will see throughout this course we will be able to draw lots of parallels between Indian and Western philosophy and the answers that they give. So there is nothing distinctive about the answers either. There is nothing distinctive about the techniques people use for answering these questions. You know, rational argumentation, critical inquiry, that's what I said, is at the, you know, is the basic method in philosophy. And so if the Indians are really doing philosophy, neither the questions, nor their answers, nor their techniques are very different. Then why should we study Indian philosophy? Why not keep studying, you know, the tradition that we do study? After all, you will find that in this course there are some words that are difficult to pronounce, you know, because they're in Sanskrit. And just to give a flavor, there is a bit of Sanskrit in this course. They're difficult to pronounce. Why am I, you know, pushing you to study Indian philosophy and pronounce these difficult words? Why not, let's just do, you know, Western philosophy? I think, and I have put on the handout, I think the best answer is given by Graham Priest, who used to be a professor at the University of Melbourne. Great logician, by the way. He was a logician for a very long time, but now has been doing Buddhist philosophy. And he's become so popular, he's gotten a job at New York University. So have a look at Graham Priest and what he does, and you'll get a sense of, and he's written quite a few articles on why we should study Asian philosophy, not just Indian philosophy. And the two reasons that he gives are on your handout. And I think one of them, the first one in particular, is, you know, the best way to understand one's culture is to study another culture. It's like learning a second language. Those of you who've learned a second language will have this understanding. You get a better insight into how your own language works, because the first language that we learn to speak, we don't learn it systematically. You know, we don't go to a grammar class to start saying sentences in our first language. We just say them. It's only when you learn a second language, you get an appreciation of grammar. You get an appreciation of sentence structure. Very similar. It's only when we study a different culture, we get a better appreciation of our own culture. That's very important. You know, studying other cultures is important because it gives us a better appreciation. Appreciation doesn't mean that wholeheartedly I will go and endorse or embrace everything in my culture. Appreciation here means critical appreciation. What's good in my culture and what's not so good in my culture. By looking at something different, you get a better insight. You start evaluating. And that's why it's important to look at a different culture. They're in different contexts. They have different living conditions from what it was in the West, even in those times. And so, you know, it's a different understanding, and that will give us some insight into our own culture. That's, I think, a very good reason, a richly rewarding and a valuable reason to study Indian philosophy. The other reason is that given that, you know, you're looking at different philosophers from a different culture, there is more hope of making progress in philosophy. It's a very big question in philosophy. You know, are we making progress? I said we've been trying to answer these questions since 500 BC, and still there is scope to add something to it. Haven't we been able to answer this question? I mean, some people just say, you know, I don't know if you've heard this before, but all of philosophy is footnotes to Plato. And all we do is just write footnotes to Plato, and this generation of students is going to write further footnotes to Plato. No, I don't think it is that. I think we do make genuine progress in philosophy, and it is here that it is valuable to study philosophy from another culture, because there is hope of making genuine progress, because different ideas, different viewpoints will come into being. When I said, you know, we can draw some parallels between Indian and Western philosophy, I didn't mean that there is nothing that is distinctive or new in Indian philosophy. Surely there are going to be some matters of detail which might give us new insights as to how to answer these questions, how to be critical about the other answers that people in the Western tradition, philosophers in the Western tradition have given. But that said, you know, let me put my cards on the table. I don't think, you know, like some of the people who are writing articles in the popular magazines that I mentioned, I don't think that studying Indian philosophy is essential. Studying Indian philosophy is valuable, but studying Indian philosophy is not essential to a good education in philosophy. Right? If one of the reasons you've done this course is because you think it's essential to do a course in Indian philosophy to have a good education, I don't think for purposes of research training or a good education in philosophy that you need to study any particular tradition, any particular philosopher, any particular language or anything like that. I mean, I will say that, you know, very, very clearly that for me, there's nothing like Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy and Asian philosophy and all of those things. There is philosophy, full stop, right? And you do need to study a lot of philosophy to get a good education in philosophy, but you do not need to study, you know, any particular philosophy. That's not essential. So I just, you know, I think there's so much happening on this debate that it really is important to say that, you know, don't think that there is something, you know, essential about studying Indian philosophy. It's interesting. I'll make this class fun. I'm not suggesting don't do this subject and don't come back next week. Not at all. That's not the idea. But, you know, just treat it as any other philosophy class. What you're going to learn is how to argue, but we will learn it by studying arguments and views offered by people from a very different culture from our own. not from my own, because I was born in India and brought up in India, and some students here, but for most of us, it's going to be a very different culture. Any questions at this point? Okay, so perhaps we should move on to the historical background. So, as I said before, I wish these people had a whiteboard rather than all this. You can see I'm very ancient in my attitudes. I would like a blackboard to write on rather than this stuff. Now, people tell me you can write on the computer. I'm too scared to do that. But anyway, so let's go to the historical background. The source of Indian philosophy is the Vedas. Now, the Vedas are, if you like, you can treat it like the Bible in the Western tradition. It's the religious as well as a philosophical text. Now, here's a question for you. Hinduism, Buddhism, these, two things most famously are known as religions. What's the difference between religion and philosophy? I want to ask you both, doing a major in religion as well as philosophy. What do you think is common or different? Anything about, you said, oh, there's going to be overlap, this is the perfect course. Tell me why. Why did you expect this to be the perfect course? What's happening, with Hinduism being a religion as well as a philosophy? I mean, anyone else can add to it if you want to. You can help your colleagues out. This is the best way to learn, to ask questions and try and have a discussion that helps other people rather than always criticizes what others are saying. You're allowed to disagree, but you're also allowed to help. Why is Buddhism both a religion and a philosophy? Why is Hinduism both a religion and a philosophy? Hmm?
Because there are kind of canons of conduct, like rules to follow. It's not just about thinking, but a way of being and living your life.
Yeah,
So
good.
Makes it a religion as opposed to just a way of thinking.
Yeah, as opposed to a way of thinking, and as opposed to, as we said, a critical way of thinking. Just as opposed to, yes, I think that's a very important insight. There is a given set of rules, at least in the case of Hinduism. How should one live? There is a given set of rules in a text, so to say. In a text, some source of authority. Some people say the Vedas are the word of God, like, the Bible is the word of God. Some people say it was actually spoken by the gods and the sages just wrote it down, and that's what the Vedas are. But there is this notion of, in a religion, there is this notion of there being a text or a source which cannot be questioned. God as the source of the Bible, or, the Hindu gods, and there are many and many, many of them, and I'll tell you more about them in today's class. But the idea is, in philosophy, that's the difference between religion and philosophy. In philosophy, that appeal to authority is thrown out of the window. In philosophy, you can't accept just because, it is said in the book. That's never a good reason for a philosophical argument, right? You can't make a philosophical argument by saying, Monima said this in class. Or, the book says, the study guide says such and such, or the Hindu scriptures that we read in class say such and such. That's not a good philosophical argument. But that kind of thing works for religion. When there is authority behind a certain leader or God or, any authoritative person, for whatever reason, we accept it as being. And so the Vedas, in that sense, were sacred texts. It's difficult to say, when they were exactly written. The Indian tradition, for a very long time, was an oral tradition. Writing came much, much later in the Indian tradition. It was an oral tradition in the sense this is how, you studied. They were sages or the gurus. They had their own schools. And students would go there, and you spent part of your life there. That was the first part of your life as a student would be spent in what is called a gurukul. So you lived there, you learned all the things. You just didn't, it was not like just coming to university and going back home and, leading your own life. You'd be stuck with the guru for, a good number of years. And you learned everything in that community. You learned how to clean the place, you learned how to grow vegetables, you learned, how to look after the animals, you learned everything. But all the education was never by writing or no computers at all. It was all by listening to the guru. The guru would say something, would make a statement, and it was always a very aphoristic statement, not very clear what's being said. And then part of the job was interpreting what the guru was saying. So different students came up with what might be meant by this statement. So the guru would say, a shloka, which is an aphorism in Sanskrit, and just stop. And then it would be up to the students to argue amongst themselves and, come up with what the right interpretation is. We could do a class like that if you like along the way. I will say it in English, and then you can argue about what exactly is being said, what is the argument here, and so on and so forth, and then go on to criticize that argument. Even though, in the presence of the guru, they would believe what the guru would say. And I will give you a flavor of this because they're Indian texts. They don't say, this is my objection. They say, the opponent might argue. So that's how the discussion continues. These things are written much, much later. Initially, it's an oral tradition which, sort of trains people in this very different way, that you have to do the hard work as a student. So in this Indian philosophy class, it's not going to be a matter of sitting and listening. I'm going to get you to do some of the hard work and think about what is being said and respond in class. So no more of not giving me answers. Get ready to actually, do the readings by next week. Everything is laid out on Moodle and all that. So I would expect you will have done the reading for next week and have things to add in class, because that's how the Indian tradition worked. I'm not wearing the Indian dress just for fun. I want to actually create that environment where you learn in the same kind of way, push you a little bit further. So these texts are written from about, people say 1000 BC. That's the time they start getting written. And up to the time of Buddha, you have the Vedas about 500 BC. That's when they name. After 500 BC, there is another sort of phase in Indian philosophy, if you like. So what you have in the Vedas, as I said, are religious texts. There are lots of hymns, lots of praises to the gods. But there is also, reflective questioning in the Vedas. They're not completely, exempt from some philosophical underpinnings. So on page 3, this is your textbook or study guide. I've got a little hymn it's called the Creation Hymn from the Rig Veda. And just to give you a sense of, this, even in the Vedas, even in the basic texts, there was, some philosophical attitude, so to say. So this is talking about creation. There was neither known existence nor existence then. There was neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? Was there water bottomlessly deep? I'll read a little more. Desire came upon that one in the beginning. That was the first seed of mind. Poets seeking in their hearts with wisdom found the bond of existence in non-existence. Their code was extended across, was there below, was there above, very much like the Bible. There was no sky, there was no ground, there was no heaven. There were seed places, there were powers, there was impulse beneath, there was giving forth above. Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is the creation? The gods came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? So you get a lot of questions. They don't have a definite answer to how it all started, how creation began. In the Vedas, you don't get a story about, there was God, and God willed this, and on day one this happened, and on day two that happened, and so on and so forth. What you get is, here's something we need to explain. How did this begin? But in the Indian way of thinking about it, the gods came after the creation of the universe. I will get to that. I will get to the cycle of birth and rebirth and talk about. Yeah. So whence this creation has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps even he does not know. So they're not giving any authority to one God. The Vedas suggests that knowledge is this kind of, thing that can only be sort of had or learned in a community when we study the text, when we worry about these questions. How come all this began? And there are no definite answers. I mean, this is, a very philosophical part of the Vedas. Some places you will see just lists of how one should live, what one should do, what are your duties, depending on what caste you belong to, and so on and so forth. A lot of it is prescriptive, but some of it, at the same time, is not just prescriptive, but also giving you a sense of, questioning. Some things, at least, are left open in the Vedas. The last part of the Vedas, and some of you who've read more broadly would have come across, is called the Upanishads. The Upanishads is where you get most of this philosophical stuff. There's a part which is just the hymns, there is a part which is just prescriptions about how to perform rituals and so on and so forth. But there is also the last part of the Veda, which is called the Upanishads, are the part where a lot of philosophical questions are raised. I have some excerpts from the Upanishads on page 5. That's reading 1.1 from a couple of the famous Upanishads, just to give you a sense of the philosophical stuff that happens. There is discussion about the self. There is discussion about how we are to understand pleasure, what constitutes ignorance, what constitutes knowledge, and so on and so forth. I won't read anything right now, but I'm just pointing you to this. It might be worth having a little read of this. You will see some of this will come in handy, when we look at more detailed text. So after the Vedas and the Upanishads, in the early period, so from about 1000 to 500 BC, after that you get what is called the Sutra period. That's the time where the most important texts of Indian philosophy are written. And that's also the time, in fact, the Buddhists are already on the stage. So not only you get the sutras, which are these aphorisms that the sages say, but also commentary, discussion on behalf of various disciples. So these disciples themselves wrote, extensive commentaries on the Sutra period, which goes from about 500 BC to about the 1st century AD. You can say that's the Sutra period, and after that you don't get any new schools forming, but all you get is new commentaries. So that's why the Sutra period is where Hindu philosophers disagree amongst themselves. Why are they disagreeing among themselves? It's because the Buddhists are questioning the doctrines in the Vedas, and different philosophers, different sages have different opinions about how they might be interpreted, how they might be defended. That's where you get a whole variety of different schools in Hindu philosophy. I've got these names on your handout. There are 6 schools of Indian philosophy. 6 schools of Hindu philosophy. The Hindu philosophers are those who are trying to defend the authority of the Vedas. Not taking the Vedas as, a fixed text. They're trying to interpret it. They're trying to sort of come up with philosophical theses. But the Hindu schools try to defend the authority of the Vedas. They're also called the Astika schools, who say, yes, the Vedas are authoritative. And there are 6 of them. This is on the first page, bullet points sort of down the bottom. There's Sankhya, Yoga. You've heard about yoga as a practice. Yoga is also one of the schools. In fact, one of the first texts we'll look at in this course is the Yoga Sutras. Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. These are the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy. And through this course, you don't need to learn all these names today. Through this course, you will study bits of one or the other just to give you a flavor of what they're saying. And then the 3 heterodox schools who questioned everything that was in the Vedas, and they're Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvak. As I said, there's going to be lots of Buddhism in this course and some Charvaks as well. So it is after this Sutra period, after the formation of the schools, after the, if you like, the work of interpretation is done, you get the commentary period. After the sutras, you get the commentary period, which I think is really the golden age in Indian philosophy, and other people also agree. This is about the 3rd century BC to about the 10th century AD. You get lots of commentaries, lots of rich philosophy. If you go on to study Indian philosophy in more depth in the future, which I hope you will do, you will come across these texts and you will see they're as deep as philosophical and rich as Plato's dialogues or Aristotle's works or any other philosopher for that matter in any other tradition.